Welcome to the Great Security Debate. This show has experts taking sides to help broaden understanding of a topic. Therefore, it's safe to say that the views expressed are not necessarily those of the people we work with or for. Heck, they may not even represent our own views, as we take a position for the sake of the debate. Our website is greatsecurity.debate.net, and you can contact us via email at feedback@greatsecurity.debate.net or on Twitter @SecurityDebate. Now, let's join the debate, already in progress.
When we were comparing, people said, how did Israel become a cybersecurity, powerhouse? And this goes back, several years of different writings, readings. But one of the big parts was making the military a startup incubator and accelerator. In the number of years they spend in the military in those studies versus in North America, where it was around 1 year before you transition to something else. And the conversation even back then was 1 year was not enough time to become even close to being an expert or the level of coding or reverse engineering that the Israelis were capable of. And they said, well, why is that so? And it went on to point out there was a few things. One of them, and this goes back to what we were just saying about China. One, the government as a coordinator, the government as a business catalyst, making the military a startup incubator and accelerator, investing then in human capital, and then embracing interdisciplinary and diversity. But you look at where that started from, and then the rest goes on to talk about rethink the cyber, rethink the box. But you look at the beginning part of it, that catalyst part, it almost feels like we're on the cusp of that with, what happened with SolarWinds, the announcements for the government, all the things they want to mandate. But right now, a lot of that is around cybersecurity posture. So all the vendors are running in there. I mean, lobbyists in Capitol Hill. Here's what you need. It's what you were just talking about, Eric. Do I need this? Do I need this? Do I need this? No, what I need is this. No, everyone's in there telling these guys, here's what you need to buy.
You need. It's an inverse model to what you described in Israel, which is an inside out. And here we've got the commercial interests drive the other direction.
Right. Yeah. And I think we mentioned it. I think we may have talked about it on one of the podcasts too, about it, cyber insurance starting to head that direction as well now, that they're talking about dictating certain, here's your pool of technologies. They've been vetted that if you use these technologies, these will lower your premiums. Yeah. And that worries me.
I've had more discussions since then to confirm that we are hearing a little more of that direction, that the tech will drive the tech will drive. So now we have it's a formulary. It's a security technology insurance formulary. And as much as I dislike it in healthcare, I think I will dislike it in tech. And the example I'll use is the current EU, nothing to do with security, but the current EU debate on a standard plug for mobile devices. The EU recently passed some legislation focusing on USB-C as the standard power for mobile devices. They don't want waste. They don't want multiple different standards, Lightning, USB-C, other things, but to focus on USB-C. Well, here's the thing. USB-C is not new. USB-C is probably over half of its lifetime is already done, and the law goes in. There was I was listening to some debates, and I can't recall who was making this debate, but it's, government moves slowly. And so, in this case, I think the insurance will move just as slowly, that the 10-year life cycle before they come back and revisit this topic. And now USB-C is long in the tooth. So now let's translate that into security and say, use product Y and you'll be great. The next time it's advantageous for them, either when their contract or their, whatever agreement guided that particular decision expires, that's the time it'll be renewed, not necessarily when it is best for us as an industry, as a bleeding edge, those that want to try it. No one will want to be on the bleeding edge anymore. And now we get we slow down, not just innovation, but acceptance and the early adopter phase that lets others become comfortable with using new tech. starts to go away, and now we get a much softer, longer cycle, which means slow to respond to new threats.
Right. But in all fairness, I mean, this isn't the first time we've seen this play out in technology. I mean, if we look at some of our frameworks, have typically played the same game of being behind the curve. I mean, I'm going to take a shot at PCI real quick. That, you know, it tried to be too prescriptive in the technologies and what you're going to do. So for the longest time, and it might still say this, that you have to run an antivirus scan.
Oh, right. Yeah.
As an industry, we've moved way past that. We should be talking about risk tolerances and thresholds. What is the overall objective we're trying to achieve? Because with the runway of technology and how we're doing things, it's got to be, whatever the control is, it's got to be adaptable over time. Because as we move into EDR and some of those technologies, that instead of doing the check the box, I scanned once every 24 hours, we're now into real-time risk assessment of what's going on. And many of the players now can even that, okay, I scanned it in real time, labeled it as good, but then later on learn that, oh, that actually wasn't good. And I can go back and replay it and catch it and clean up that event, right? That if you look at it from a risk response perspective, what we have today is far better than what we had, but the control still says, thou shalt scan once a day.
Well, we're still seeing people trying to get out of hard written contracts that say passwords need to be 8 characters, upper, lower. You know, some of this now arcane stuff made sense at the time, but you codify it in a way that makes it nearly impossible to get out without reopening the whole rest of your contract with either a client or a provider, and no one's incentivized to move on. So, you know, the hard coding of this is in any form. I mean, and, you know, this is the time of year in the US when people don't look forward, you know, people really don't look forward to choosing new benefits, playing the gambling game of what health will I have next year, and what is on that, what got changed in the formulary. As a security provider, I don't want to, you know, once a year quake and wonder what tech I've already invested in is no longer on that list. You know, I've put a 3-year investment in and $1 million into the the installation and the uptake within my organization, and now poof, it's no longer on the formulary, and now my insurance rates rise and I have to spend on one side or spend on the other to replace it.
I was going to be cautious to say I'm a vendor. And I say that because, Eric, when you mentioned EDR, when the insurance companies started saying, well, in order to, this relates more to healthcare manufacturing, that if you wanted to be able to either keep your cyber insurance or else pay X in terms of X more, then you had to have an EDR in place. And a lot of that stemmed around ransomware and the fact that if they had to come in and do an investigation and there wasn't an EDR in place, then they had to roll one out. The time, the cost to do it, if the company didn't want to pay the ransom, the insurance company still has to perform the remediation. So it was all around cost.
Right.
So for them, it was, we're going to tell you have to have an EDR in place. It wasn't which one, but you have to have an EDR in place, and you can keep your cyber insurance policy, or it'll be at this rate. That really changed everything in terms of internally. What some people were saying, it was, oh wow, everybody has to have them. We should be targeting everybody who has AV right now and make sure we get them with an EDR and we can tell them that it's an insurance purpose. And there goes the business saying, I mean, your direction isn't about, let's take a look at your environment. Does this work good for you? Like, what are the operating systems you're using? No, it's, you need to have this or else you can't get cyber insurance. And it goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning.
And that's exactly it. I think it overlooks that we have multiple levers that we can pull for risk. That if we change the conversation around risk objectives, what are we trying to do? We put companies in a better frame to solve risk as they need to. So for instance, we'll just look at EDR, right? EDR, I'm not trying to take a shot at EDR. EDR is a good evolution on antivirus, but it's not the only way to solve endpoint hygiene. I've seen organizations that instead said, hey, we're going to go through the process of blacklisting, whitelisting, or actually it'd be the process, whitelisting would be the best one in that case, that says, I'm going to define all known good software allowed to run on this PC. Anything outside of that is not going to be allowed to run. So you diminish the impact an EDR play could bring to the table because you've already gone through what I would say is a much tougher process on defining known good, and nothing else gets to run. But I think as some of our frameworks, as policies, insurance policies, and I think this is going to play out as we start to think about, if the US finally gets around, pushing a more holistic legislation at a federal level on security, that they become too prescriptive. And I think a couple episodes ago, I forget why we were on the topic, but I think I brought up the concept of the law of the horse, right? That the whole idea is the law of the horse, that if you made something that was too specific from law, by the time it actually goes through its paces and gets into law, it is no longer relevant. Exactly what you were talking about, Dan, being long in the tooth. But if you take a step back, and what's the intent? The intent is I'm going to make a law around some type of vehicle that's going to get you somewhere. And if you write it the right way, that it works for not only the horse and buggy, but it works for the car, a train. It can be more, it's got a longer lifespan. And that's, I think, from a framework perspective, and it took me a long time to get this, though. I think we've really got to reframe it from technical controls to identifying process risk and objectives and what we're trying to achieve.
Well, that also assumes that it assumes that organizations have and will take their own security and risk into account when making business decisions. And I think up until recently, that hasn't been a guarantee, which is one of the reasons that the insurers would like to start to enforce that. It's becoming a more normal commercial imperative. So I'm taking a flip side to this, to that, and say that, the economics of security are not always great. They're not always immediate. They're not always, what have you done for me this quarter? The economics of security are long-term. They're potentially transparent or, invisible to the bottom line. And therefore it's harder to make them stick inside an organization. And the stick becomes an outside force. And if it's not legislation, then maybe it is insurance. Maybe it is a set of regimes that do that, that enforce them, because otherwise you can't operate. But that said, I think that there's, increasing play inside organizations to actually focus on these things, because they are becoming a market force, because they are becoming a commercial imperative. You can't do business if you don't have certain things in place, because we're checking each other in theory, or at least sending a lot of questionnaires to each other that have checklists in them that people answer. But I think the close of this whole long comment is that this is a reaction to a previous action. And I fear that this reaction does not align with where market forces are going. I think that market forces will demand that people put security and privacy into their products. But regulating them in this particular way, in a prescriptive way, will actually hamper that more than help it.
I would agree, because I think what it does by creating a finite list that you have to choose from this bucket, that you hamper the ability of good security teams, that you cut down what's in their arsenal to use to address risk. And many good teams out there are in a far better position to understand the ecosystem, the controls, their own risk, than are some of the insurance companies. And I get it, to your point, Dan, that there are still companies out there that are going to, I think, what we would mutually agree on, making the wrong decisions. But I still think that if we write it in a risk-based term rather than a tech-focused terminology, that we can achieve the same objectives. I mean, look, as we've gone through contracts, we've both been in a position where you're writing in language that's commercially reasonable. We've got a whole basket of terms that don't lock us into specific technology plays, but we're still achieving the same objective.
Right. To a reasonable standard rather than perfect standards, which are, by definition, unachievable.
I wholeheartedly agree with you there, Eric, because I think one thing that's, I won't say that's changed when we're having the conversation about, some of the superpowers in cybersecurity. a lot of that is around the products they've developed, not necessarily not necessarily around the fact that they have the most secure framework, et cetera. It's the products they've been developing. And then when you ask, well, why have they been developing these products? Well, because they're trying to protect organizations that are buying all this software, that some of the software, and it's not just software that could have issues, 0 days, et cetera, but where's the largest production or producers of said software that has 0 days? Well, a lot of that comes out of North America. So we spend a lot of money on all these new software technologies that drive business, right? That drive business outcomes. And now we have a lot of security companies that are trying to drive the narrative that they're supporting these business outcomes, right? With their technology. So buy this, buy widget A, widget B, widget C, and everything underneath it, and we'll be able to protect that. But if I kind of pivot this one on its head, Dan, you sent out an interesting article this weekend about the chip manufacturing and why can automotive companies not get chips? And is it really because production is at 500% right now for chip manufacturing? But the kind of narrative in the story was it's really hard to produce all the automotive chips that are needed because it runs on a very old kind of technology, that even to run at the thickness of those wafers that are coming out and the number that are actually produced is, that's 10, 20 years ago, where now they can produce on a much smaller wafer, 10x the number of chips that come out. So why would we want to produce the old ones? Well, backing up then, 20 years ago, the automotive market made up 25% of these chips. And now they make up a much smaller percentage. But one of the reasons, Dan, they were using those technologies, to them it was more secure, rather than coming into some of this newer technology, which they maybe haven't performed all the testing needed around the requirements and some of the security issues that may be out there, not just from a vulnerability standpoint, but the idea that this could fail in a few years in its lifetime, and then you have to pull the vehicle off.
And human lives are on the line in cars in a way that they aren't necessarily in other, in other devices. So you have, zero tolerance for failure. But my challenge in this article, and I put this article in the show notes, take a look at it. It's a good Jalopnik piece on this. But the problem is you still have to produce something that is commercially manufacturable. And, we can only, if you aren't commanding enough as an industry of a technology to keep the fabs running at that level, and if you haven't read the article or you don't intend to, they're using chipsets in some case that are on 2007 fabrication technology from the time the original iPhone came out. So the fabs are about producing more and more and more in smaller sizes, and to support the bigger market share. But how, at that point, is it reasonable to say, well, this is all we can do? Or do you have to move on in order to enable, is security a good enough excuse to stay back in those levels? Or I guess at what point do you have to press on, knowing that there's potentially, life risk or, security or technology risk in doing so? It's a really tough choice.
And I compare that to the rest of industry, which started adapting and using newer technologies, using new software, because it was bringing the business up to speed faster on some of the what their goals or targets were. And with that came some security risk. Same thing when I think and Eric, you may know this better than I do, some of the funny quotes that were out there around cloud. And it would be like, well, just move everything to the cloud because the cloud is the most secure. And it's not that the cloud is or is not more secure. A lot of it has to do around configuration and so forth and hygiene. But the cloud is very new to a lot of people and a lot of companies, which means that the chance of making, I hate to use the word mistakes, poor choices or decisions when formatting or creating your architecture could be there, right? And a lot of what we've seen, where so-and-so was breached, and you hear the word breached and it sounds like, oh man, somebody like forced their way into the environment, stole all this stuff. No, they found a misconfigured S3 bucket and got on in there, just kind of sat there, pulled a bunch of stuff out and left before they were caught. The wording that people use in the highlights when you read them inside the context, inside stories, can kind of be misleading. But as you move to these newer architectures, move to the cloud, as you move to new technology stacks, having a security team, and this goes back to people, right, versus product, working with those IT technology folks that are implementing the new softwares for the business, I think becomes incredibly important. And that goes all the way back to when someone says, how did Israel become a cybersecurity powerhouse? It started with government, started with military, and started with creating these initiatives, which created people that were very highly skilled at developing code, doing reverse engineering, and thinking outside of the box. So it wasn't that they were saying, we should come up with 500 products that we can sell to other countries. No, it wasn't that at all. It was looking at it from a different standpoint, investing in people.
Yeah. Go ahead, Dan.
Let's say, which is interesting because, you know, we talk about the flip side here, and we have, I spend a lot of time talking with people who are coming out of the military, with veterans who are coming out even from information security roles inside the Air Force, inside other branches. And they have an amazingly hard time being accepted and integrated into US business, which I find to be really unfortunate. And you know, I wonder if there's things we can learn from that Israeli model, where where that expertise path comes from, comes from military and people who are doing great funded things to both defend, protect, and advance information security on a reconnaissance basis, on an intelligence basis, on a defense, and on a proactive basis, and better use and gain better acceptance for those folks into U.S. business. Because I don't know if you guys are seeing the same experience or having the same discussions, but it feels like they're just not welcome, and I think that's a big mistake.
I think it goes back to, and we've had this debate here, and I'm going to sidestep a soapbox moment, but I think we tend to gravitate in America to quantifiable aspects, and quantifiable aspects translates in our area to certification, schooling, and all of those things, rather than trying to look at somebody's experience and what they bring to the table. And we completely miss that. And Brian, I want to touch on something you said, that you were talking about the aspect of people and the overall equation, and how true that really is. If we think about security, we think about it in the context of people, processes, and then last technology, right? That's security is in the people and processes. That if you just focus on that third leg in technology, that's not security at all. That's blinky lights and cool things that you're putting in there. That's what scares me about the prescriptive security on technology, that we're going to forget, that we're going to get lulled into this false sense of security. Well, you had on the list that if I have these technologies, therefore I'm secure, that my risk is kept. Well, it's not the case. And Brian, you hit it perfectly. That's the cloud migration, that so many companies move there. Well, we're going to the cloud. Amazon, Google, Microsoft, they're doing security. They've got a bigger team behind it. Yeah, but did you read the SOC reports? Have you read anything that talks about how it's beholden to your controls? They've empowered you to make risk-based decisions, but it's still on you as the company to understand how to operate, how to configure the given environment to maintain your risk tolerances.
And I hate to go back to automotive here, but people, process, product. And I can remember when we started working with a new supplier around seating for a very large auto manufacturer, and they were about to put in one-piece flow. And it was their first assembly line that they were going to do this, and they had to meet all the takt times. And they invested in this incredibly automated line. Let's call that automated line the cloud. They're like, well, we invested in this heavily automated line. The manufacturer told us that we hit this takt time, and we should be able to meet all the requirements of the OE. The first 3.5, 4 months, they had the customer shut down no more than once every other day. And why? Because the people didn't understand how to use the assembly line, all this new automation and all the computers and all the manufacturer that all this equipment was in their facility nonstop. And they ended up having to go back to their previous manual assembly lines to try to meet the product demands until they could get that line working. And they ended up having to split that line in half so that it wasn't exactly one piece flow anymore. Because if they did that and there was ever a shutdown, there was no piece flow. And no piece flow means 0 parts out. And to your point there, Eric, what ends up happening, you move to the cloud, well, they have all these people, there's all this automation, it's already in there. It's the same thing in the manufacturing, but the people and process, that's why it goes people, process, product. And the people and process are inherently so important to that, right? And I can't kind of beat that one up enough.
Right. You know, I kind of think about it going back to Dan, what you were talking about on veterans and us not, you know, as I look at security in general and kind of hiring practices and kind of playing off of what I was saying about certifications and all of that, that it put that back in the context of DEI, right? Back in the context of inclusion. And we mostly, you know, this is a very generic statement, but we're missing out on that. You know, it's not across the board because I am seeing changes out there. You know, I'll call out Martin Bally's doing a great job in trying to reach out and bring students up, help give back. You know, it's kind of bringing in individuals from different walks of life, and we need that for security. And I think we're by and large, we're missing that today. And that's a huge gap and an opportunity for us to bring in the people side of it, of not trying to stay very homogenous on here's the list of requirements that you have, the 15 years of Kubernetes, I'm going to keep going back to that one because that is just brilliant. These are the certifications that you have to have, all of these very check the box activities, that we create a very homogenous group looking at security with blinders on.
Yep.
Yeah,
and
go
I
ahead,
totally
Dan.
agree. We'll just continue to get more of the same, and what we have now isn't quite working, and it's not enough, and it's not broad enough, and we need to expand that. Brian, I want to jump back to something you mentioned about the single flow, and you have this long process, and a little bit some similar but different. And one of the things that's come up a lot in security discussions is around availability, and we keep coming back to the supply chain as the last 2 years of industrial supply chain as an indicator of how we in security should be critical or be thinking about how availability of systems. There's an interesting article with a title that will rub some the wrong way, but it's I put it in the show notes. It's a CNN piece from last week called "How America Ruined Christmas." And one of the pieces in it, one of the parts in it describes the razor thin supply chain that we have created over time in order to be the most possibly efficient, if quote unquote efficient, make it so that there is absolutely just in time all the way across the board. And therefore, when there's something upstream that falters, the entire thing falls apart fast. And we're seeing the price of that now. People come to us from information security perspective. You know, one of the major functions is around availability and how to keep those systems going and keep processes moving. And this is one of those areas that keeps coming up. And when you talked about this, this flow breaking on a regular basis, it reminded me of this. And I wanted to see if you both have had more discussions around supply chain and supply chain process, and putting more cushion in because it's better for long-term availability versus razor thin focus on what have you done for me today in reducing costs versus the long-term. So short-term gain for long-term results in long-term pain versus long-term gain by dealing with some short-term pain, meaning a less efficient process.
Now, don't quote Brian Schneebly on this, and I have no new material that I've read recently, but I believe whether you want to look at automotive, whether you want to look at lumber, whether you want to look at paint, you pick the product. And they've looked at, I can pick a certain company out that isn't in automotive, and they just had their best quarter that they've ever had ever. And they sold 50% less than the best quarter they've ever had. And that's I think they said it was like 52-year history. And they said the reason for that, just the margins are incredibly high because of the demand.
Mm-hmm.
So
is it because they put a $10,000 ad sticker on the side at the end of each one?
But my point here goes back even from a vehicle side. And I replied back to somebody this weekend, and I said, that's a very interesting article, and not the article you shared, Dan, but somebody else had an interesting article, and it was complimenting Elon Musk, and it said that look what he was able to do. He just said Tesla just had the best quarter ever in production, and I said, okay, but what does that mean? The article didn't talk about, well, he was able to procure these microprocessors, but to your point, he's using newer ones, not older ones, older technology, and also I'm pretty sure he was willing to pay a premium for those if he could get them in, because the market responds much better to Tesla hitting their numbers than it does to the fact that if you look at the first half of the year, when the autos blew out their numbers, all the auto manufacturers, their stock didn't jump up the same way Tesla's just did for having one quarter. And they only produced like a little over 200,000 vehicles in that quarter. Take a look at how many everybody else still produced, right? So the whole stock market in the ups and downs is pretty wild. But like you just said, from a supply chain standpoint, all this just-in-time one-piece flow, you end up getting a kink in the chain, it breaks, everything shuts down. Well, it's treated everybody pretty well in terms of they realize that, you know what, we don't need to produce 50,000 variations of the truck. We're going to produce 6 of them in the highest content ones, and people are willing to pay for it, and we're going to make more profit on them. Let's do that. And we're actually making more money on it. And we're I'm not saying people are holding North America, I don't want to use the word hostage in the sense of we're keeping all the demand up because we're not able to put enough supply back into it. But it kind of feels that way.
That's, I think about, so Brian made the comment on LinkedIn recently about the books read around this group and all of that. So, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention some type of book or that was read along this point. But if you get the chance, Simon Sinek put out a great book called The Infinite Game that starts to talk about this. If you take a step back and take it away from supply chain and just look at companies on a holistic basis and why they exist, that he started to go through kind of the history of Adam Smith, laissez-faire, the free market, and then enters in Milton Friedman. Then all of a sudden we change and we're beholden to shareholders, right? And you start to look at the difference between companies that have a greater cause playing the infinite game or those that have a play finite. It's all about revenue. And I think as it ties back to the supply chain, you have a lot of companies that played the finite game, that it was all about maximizing revenue. It was all about, we're going to tighten this. We're going to shrink it to the point where if one thing's out of order, it all just collapses. But we kind of did this to ourselves. This, as a society, this is what we started to do, that we started to focus on revenues above all else and return to those that have invested in the company. Now, I think this is changing, right? If you go back, I don't remember if it was last year, 2 years ago, the Business Roundtable changed this and said that, all right, that you should be beholden to societal views and all that, that it's the greater societal good, if you will. I forget the exact context that they put it in, but trying to create some shift back. And that's what Simon was getting to in his book, that if you look at the companies, and there's a couple in there that'll go into Walmart, Microsoft, and some others, and looking at the eras that they went through where they almost ceased to exist because they changed the finite mentality that was all about revenue, and how that doesn't play on a long enough scale. You create more systemic issues, bigger problems. Now that I got my book plug in there.
So part of our role then as security leaders and practitioners is to encourage longer term thinking.
Well, I was going to throw this out. Yeah. But again, part of this whole, when you look at the revenue and everything else, or I won't say everything else, when you look at the idea of revenue generation and increasing profit and why you had the just in time and the one piece flow, et cetera, was if you could reduce down your inventory levels, okay, what you're buying from a supply side. So you're spending X on all your supply and bringing it in, and you store this material, all right? So from a cost side, you have all this material that's sitting. And it was, well, if you could reduce down the number of days of that material, and I call it material, but it could be anything, right, that you're purchasing, right, to build your finished part. And then take the inventory, say, of a a Ford dealership, a car dealership, right? If you can reduce down those inventories, and now it's a pull versus push method, right? You're able to increase, so you're reducing down your costs, you're increasing the profit level then, for the same amount of revenue that you were creating before when you had all this other inventory. So it made a lot of sense. But like you said, then one kink in the chain, you break that, well, now you have no inventory, you can't pull anything. But this is where, if the business thought about it, where security comes in even more, right? Because if you're talking about maximizing your uptime potential, reducing downtime, right? Whether it's your manufacturing line, whether it's your business or everything else. In today's realm, with all the new softwares and technologies you're buying, then that would become part of your PFEMA, your DFEMA, right? Like that's something you're putting in there that says, how else could my process shut down outside of like just the lights being turned off? Oh, well, what if we got hit with some type of malware or a virus or this? It could shut us down. What are we doing to protect ourselves? And it's not just what product did we buy? It's not that. It's, well, what are we doing to secure? And this is why a lot of OEs would say, okay, we're going to take all these plants, put them on separate networks, the lines themselves. And we're basically going to try to air gap this part of the environment to protect the uptime availability of that, right? Well, now as your business starts to move to the cloud, though, what have we done to invest in both the people to make sure that the process is good, right? And what tools do we actually need to really buy in order to do this right? And I think that becomes part of the business thinking, right? It's not just, okay, well, what do we need to buy? How many people do you need? It's, right. Well, let's look at it. Let's sit down and draw it out the same way you did your manufacturing line when you were thinking about building this vehicle 2.5 years ago. And now you're calling me in at the final hour?
Well, I think it's good. You know, if I could summarize some of it was, you know, technology cannot shortcut the time needed to invest to create a good process. Right. You can't shortcut that. You have to focus on the process and what are you trying to achieve? You know, you kind of, Brian, naturally went down the road of TPS and what Toyota did. You know, as you look at Taiichi Ono, that the goal wasn't to minimize costs and all of that, that it was optimization of a process. And it's the same thing that if you read the goal from Goldratt, that's talking about bottlenecks and all of that, the focus was optimizing the plant floor. And I believe Taiichi Ono, the way he kind of likened it was drawing it to water, right? You pull into a bay, you pull into a body of water, you don't know where the rocks are. So by lowering the water, you understand where the rocks are, where the hurdles are that you're going to run into. And that was the whole thing on drawing down on inventory on the plant floor, that if you could draw down on work in progress, the amount on the floor, you could start to see where the bottlenecks were so you could optimize it. Fast forward though, and you saw a number of companies that tried to implement TPS because they liked the end result. And, oh, I just want to shortcut it and I just want to create the end result. But no, you didn't understand the process. The process is what got you there. And it's the same thing with security.
And there was no pause there, people. I was sitting here shaking my head. Yes, 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 yes. People, process, product.
And just to bring it all back around to the formularies, you know, if tech drives, if the technology list drives that, you know, the focus on people and process, I think becomes diminished in this, you know, back to the point you made earlier, Eric, is, you know, you're focused on the check boxes as in PCI, and you lose sight of the process and people that need to bring that all together. The parallel I come to this though, and I'm not invoking corruption in anything I'm about to say, but you know, you do have to wonder though too about the motives of how those lists come together, you know, and who's behind them. I mean, there's a running discussion amongst many people about how do you get into insert analyst technology evaluation tool here, whether it's Magic Quadrant or other things. You know, how do you get into this particular place? And it's always done with a hint of not just a hint, with a significant overtone and sigh of skepticism and cynicism about how that list is generated. It's not necessarily the best. It's not necessarily the you know, the brightest, but it's a list. And it's a list that unfortunately people buy from. You know, we only buy in the upper right quadrant. And that's coming from, less within security, but more in technology and procurement areas. So, how have we been able to how have both of you been able to deal with those particular issues? And, the fact, if we start to see these coming from insurance companies, and as if you don't buy A, B, or C, we're not going to insure you. Yeah, I can't help but be very worried about the direction that will take. And it becomes everybody's running 4 technologies in the whole world to secure their entire environment. And we don't necessarily get the best ones.
And I mean, with a caveat though, because I think we're looking at something that's still yet to fully play out, right? Some insurance companies, my understanding, are still dabbling with it. I don't know if we've actually
just in the dabbling stage, but I'm thinking, 9 steps ahead to a list shows up. What's my first response? Cynicism over how the list was created. It's just my nature.
And this is going to be, though, that I think if this is the route that insurance companies are going to go, it's going to have to come with a heightened level of transparency. You're going to need to walk me through, how did you get this list? How did you vet? How, what's the body that is vetting that technology? Because if we look at some of the companies out there that do ratings, we'll just look at the EDR space. There is a lot of scrutiny on the methods used, on is it a truly apples to apples comparison, on this vendor was able to bring these parts of their technology, whereas this vendor was only able to bring those. And I mean, this is just one vetting body, but now you're talking about tying that to my insurance premiums, which is just going to bring a heightened level of scrutiny to how you got to that list. So I'm right there with you, Dan, that there's got to be some meticulous transparency on showing us how you got from A to Z on how that list was produced.
Yeah, and in theory, greater scrutiny equals, the greater transparency and greater scrutiny. Just, think about open source software. Some of the idea in open source is that lots of people have the ability to review it. You can ferret out issues. You can identify the gaps in the process and in the technology, and therefore have greater confidence in it than in a closed system. If that's truly the case, yes. But to date, many of those kind of things have become proprietary. What is the mechanism for evaluating a Magic Quadrant? I'm quiet because I don't have an answer. What is the mechanism for evaluating A, B, and C? I think MITRE the one you referenced, MITRE did a good job in being clear about how it was evaluated. I think there's room to grow and learn as those evaluations continue. But this is an area of, transparency isn't always the default, especially when competitive advantage is at play.
Yeah. If there's one thing I send kudos to MITRE for, though, like you said, Eric, it is very transparent in terms of when they look at vendors, each product that the vendor used in order to be involved in the MITRE attack simulation. And then even during the simulation, you can go through the entire attack progression. And when you see detections or no detections, it'll even note in there, what type of detection it was, if it was able to detect the technique or sub-technique, and how, which I think is important as well, because that allows you to say, okay, so these are the things that I would need in order to achieve, if these were my goals, right? From a fin standpoint. I'm trying to remember where I was going with this when I was originally going to make the comment. But going back to the insurance side of it, and again, for anyone listening, I'm on the vendor side of it, right? So I know Dan's giving me the eyes there.
What?
Yeah.
Why was I not told of this?
I know. I should have told you guys this before we started talking.
Transparency.
Yeah. But I'll say one thing that I see as a positive, right? And this is when I originally started working, in the cybersecurity space for a particular endpoint company 2 years ago, just over 2 years ago. If a company was involved in a breach or a ransomware incident, insurance company would come in, deploy a EDR technology. that company typically would buy that technology. They didn't have time to do a POC, et cetera. Do you think that company and that purchasing department were able to get the best price for that product? I'm just going to tell you the answer is probably no. And what I've seen now with the cyber insurance side of it, so if cyber insurers are saying, well, here's the things we would like you to have, and if not, here's what we see as your premiums. If you had this in place, and we talked about it before, an EDR in place, it's specific to them because they're asking for it simply because if they have an issue, they want to come in and be able to do the investigation, the remediation. In order to do the remediation, you had to have some type of technology in there that gave you the visibility to be able to do that. So now I'm seeing more companies saying, okay, this is what we're going to need, right? So we can start our project now. The business knows they need it because they need it for the insurance. So now they're actually able to go out and evaluate, 2 or 3 different companies and determine what's the best product in their environment. So in that case, it's the insurance side is pushing the businesses and the business side to say, you have to have this, right? And it's a two-way street here too, or a double-edged sword, because some of the businesses are saying, well, don't we currently use this? Can't we just use the product they have? And does that check that box? It does? Okay. Tell the security team that's what we're going to do. But I'm seeing a higher percentage of businesses that are telling the security team, okay, what is this thing called EDR? And, what do we need to do? And then the security teams are able to go out, work with the purchasing team to put budgets together and figure out the products they need. So on that side of it, I see a positive side, right? But again, this is coming from the vendor side and the business side. So a lot of people in this space are like, oh, yes, we should be pushing the insurers to say, you should tell them specifically about us. And it shouldn't be that, right? It really shouldn't.
But it very well could be.
Right. And I see the same thing happening from a government standpoint, where you're starting to see more and more lobbyists, more and more money being spent on trying to tell the government what they should be doing or need to be doing. And these are product companies.
Yeah, I see eye to eye with what you're saying, that there is a positive that could come out of this, I think, because you've got a list of technologies in a given space that you can give. There are companies that may need that list of understanding, all right, I need to check off having some technologies in some of these areas. But I think, to go back, and maybe the option is a hybrid, that insurance companies need to see the list not as a panacea, but also you have to have a process for me as a more mature organization to talk through risk tolerances and why we chose our tech stack and why it meets or exceeds the thresholds that you're looking to achieve with the technology that you're pushing down to me.
So is there room after all this for a risk evaluate, a neutral third-party risk evaluation of companies? SOC 2 is great but it's great for me as a company because I can answer the questions and I can do, I can define the scope. And that's the problem that comes with a lot of the current certifications and attestations of risk and control. It almost feels like the missing component here is an outside confirmation of actual risk, done in a neutral way that is not pro me as a company or pro me as a vendor, that really or me in this case, an insurance company, or a customer that, that really paints my risk in the right way. And, I know this is what the scan and dangle technology companies have tried to do of late, where they, put out scorecards and report cards and risk scores about you, but they're hyper uninformed. And they don't really paint the picture. But, is there room in this world? Is that the necessary closing point for this? And maybe are the insurance providers those people, because they have the most, they have to front the cash if something isn't quite up to snuff.
To answer your question with a question, though, are we trying to force security into being a more perfect science when it's always going to be an imperfect science? If you look at a study, when the effectiveness of a study is judged based on the controls for variables, right? And as you look at controlling variables in the security space, there are so many that you can't control. Let's look at just automotive suppliers. Risk the risks are still different across those, depending on where you are geographically. What component of the car are you making? So trying to boil it down to a single list that's applicable to all is not going to fit. Now, not to say that that should diminish our attempt to create something that's better than what it is today. I think if you tie it to insurance companies, I don't think they're the right company, the right body organization to do it, because they have a vested self-interest. I think it's got to be driven more out of practitioners. I think as we look at this group, as we look at other CISOs out there, I think you could build a consortium based on those in the actual industry, cross vertical, making sure that you've got a wide enough representation of CISOs there that, yes, I think we could start heading in the right direction, just acknowledging it'll never be perfect.
Yeah, and just to confirm, I'm not thinking about a single set of standards. What I'm talking about is verifiable, quantifiable risk. Quantifiable, and then we can get to that with some of the fair pieces today, but verifiable, which we don't have today. Not necessarily a single paintbrush, but rather that I can be assured that the answers I'm getting are not BS or spun or
when you said BS, I thought you were saying Brian Schneebly.
No. I don't know. Do you make BS answers? BS? But I mean, that's what I'm thinking about, is this neutral third party. And maybe the insurance companies aren't that, but I think that's a key piece to making all of this come together, because then I make technology investments that are verifiable, quantifiable, and in context. And that's the piece that seems to be missing from these checklists and formularies, is context.
And to Eric's point around automotive, and Eric, it'd be great to have you as a speaker at the Automotive ISAC, just around what you just said, because you take a company the size of American Axle and you have plants globally, and you have suppliers then that maybe are not North American suppliers when you're in country X, and it's a supplier out of that said country. The insurance companies that operate in that country are going to operate differently than they operate in this country, right? So it goes back to, like you said, not that there's a bad with the insurance companies pushing a narrative here or asking people to have better security posture. The reason they're asking for that is it impacts their bottom line when they're writing policy and then they have to come in and pay to have things done. So it's a business for them. But on our side, whether you're the OEM, the tier 1, the tier 2, the tier 3, those environments, and this goes back to chip production, Dan, when we were talking about using, an old microprocessor that's older technology. It's the same for manufacturers across the board when it comes to operating systems. They do have a lot of old operating systems in those environments because they were bought to go on very, very expensive equipment. And the ROI on that equipment takes a long time to get that return.
Oh, yeah.
So they're not just going to go out and say, oh, let's just update the operating system and buy a new $10 million die or a $20 million 1,200 ton transfer press. That seems completely logical. No, it's not going to happen. And that's where every environment's different. And when it comes to manufacturing, there's definitely some differences there. And like you said, not just supply chain in terms of tier 1, tier 2 older suppliers, but also supply chain in terms of the speed at which parts need to be produced today and the levels of inventories that are being held. It's a very complex environment.
Yeah, it definitely is. And that big capital investment problem isn't limited to just manufacturing. In higher ed, you have, and in research, you have large telescopes, let's say, that are run on a Windows XP machine, but these are multi-million-dollar things, and you're not going to upgrade. The vendor's not going to upgrade. It's not going to upgrade. You just have to manage that risk appropriately. You can't expect everything to be running on the newest operating system. And my kid will, I'll deny this if my kid ever asks, because I spend a lot of time telling him he needs to update his devices to the most recent for security reasons. But, we really do have to, we can't be so parochial as to think that only this newest tech is the only way it can be. But then it comes to the economics of it. We have to also be willing to pay more to support older fabs. And let's do the car example. new cars are going to cost more, I suspect, because they're going to have to pay these fabs more to keep open the older chip things, that the chip processes that do not make those fabs nearly the kind of money or the kind of volume that the newer fabrication technologies can command, and at those volumes. So now you have higher price, and in America, higher price isn't very well received, even if it equates to quality.
It's also very true. Eric, any last thoughts as we were able to kind of circle this back with a few good automotive references? I think there was at least 2 good book references, and this is right on the verge of the automotive ISAC this week. Any last impending thoughts as it relates to people, process, and product?
I was actually going to give Dan an amen to what he was saying. No, I think, and this isn't a new message that we've been talking about, as it comes to people, processes, technology.
Eric,
I think
don't tell them that every episode is the same message. Then listeners won't come back for
more.
No,
but there's a component of it that we've talked about, that look, not every company has a nation state that's going to be trying to kick down their door to get in, right? So it comes to know thyself, know your risk tolerances, know what you're up against, and understand that the technology is just part of the overall equation and how we combat cyber risk on a go forward basis. But we need to provide focus on people and processes. And part of the people side is we've got to, much like we're doing here on the podcast, we've got to continue to do it together. And, I think, and Brian, what you're going to intend with the auto ISAC, I think that's another great example of polling companies that may be competitors out in the retail space. But when it comes to cyber, we're all in this together. And I think we need to continue to collaborate and do more to face the risk together.
And on that great note, we've come to the end of yet another episode of the Great Security Debate. Brian, Eric, thanks again. Another phenomenal discussion, and one I hope that people enjoy. And if you did enjoy, please do let us know. Send us an email, feedback@greatsecurity.debate.net, or leave a message on your favorite podcast app after you've subscribed to the podcast and after you've told a couple of friends about it. Leave a little note, leave a rating, tell us what you think. If you have new topics that you want us to cover, let us know those too. You can find us on our website, www.greatsecurity.debate.net, or on Twitter @SecurityDebate. We look forward to seeing you again on the next Great Security Debate.